The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Riverside Military Academy as 72-year-old Samuel Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallways. His weathered hands gripped the handle with the same precision he had once used to hold a rifle, though none of the young cadets rushing past him would ever suspect such a thing. To them, he was simply the old janitor who appeared each morning at dawn and disappeared into the background of their privileged lives. Samuel had been working at the academy for nearly 8 years now, ever since he had quietly retired from a life most people could never imagine. His daily routine was methodical and purposeful. He would arrive at 5:30 in the morning, long before the first bugle call echoed through the dormitories. The academy grounds would be silent except for the occasional footsteps of the night security guard making his final rounds. The cleaning cart squeaked slightly as he maneuvered it around the corner toward the main academic building. Samuel had asked maintenance to fix that squeak dozens of times, but somehow it never made it to the top of their priority list. He didn't mind much anymore. In a strange way, the sound had become comforting, a steady rhythm that accompanied him through his solitary morning hours. As he unlocked the door to the administrative wing, Samuel reflected on how different his life had become. There was a time when his mornings began with intelligence briefings and strategic planning sessions, when every decision he made could affect the lives of thousands of soldiers under his command. Now his biggest decision was which classroom to clean first, and whether the cafeteria needed an extra mopping after the previous night's dinner service. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, invisible to an entire community of future military officers, young men and women who dreamed of the very career he had mastered and then quietly walked away from. But Samuel had learned long ago that true strength often lay in choosing when to step forward and when to step back. He began his work in the main hallway, methodically dusting each trophy case that lined the walls. The cases were filled with awards and photographs commemorating decades of academy achievements. Athletic victories, academic honors, and military decorations gleamed behind the glass, representing the best and brightest graduates who had gone on to serve their country with distinction. Samuel paused at one particular case that always caught his attention. Inside was a photograph from 1987 showing a group of young officers receiving commendations for exceptional service in overseas operations. The faces in the photo were serious and proud, their uniforms crisp, and their bearing unmistakably military. If anyone looked closely enough at the corner of that photograph, they might notice a younger man with familiar eyes, but the image was old enough and positioned in such a way that casual observers never made the connection. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his quiet contemplation. Samuel glanced at his watch and realized it was later than he had thought. The first group of cadets was making their way to early morning physical training, their voices carrying down the hallway with the particular mixture of enthusiasm and complaint that only young people could master. "Watch out for the janitor," came a voice from the approaching group. Samuel didn't look up from his cleaning, but he listened as the conversation continued. "Why does he have to do this stuff so early anyway?" complained another voice, this one belonging to Cadet Jessica Chun, a second-year student from California whose parents had sent her to the academy to learn discipline and focus. "Maybe because he's got nothing better to do," laughed Cadet Marcus Williams, the son of a prominent politician who had attended the academy himself decades earlier. "I mean, look at him. Guy's probably been pushing that cart around since before we were born." Samuel continued his work without reaction, though something flickered behind his eyes. He had learned patience the hard way, through years of dealing with situations far more challenging than a few thoughtless comments from teenagers who had never known real hardship or responsibility. "My dad says people like that are just taking up space," added Cadet Timothy Brooks, whose father owned a chain of successful restaurants, and who had never wanted for anything in his 18 years of life. Like, why doesn't he just retire already? He's obviously too old for this job. The group passed by without another thought, their conversation shifting to complaints about the upcoming combat tactics exam and speculation about weekend plans. Samuel watched them go, noting the casual arrogance in their stride, the way they moved through the world with the confidence of young people who had never been tested by real adversity. He had seen thousands of young soldiers over the years, and He could usually predict which ones would thrive under pressure and which ones would crumble when faced with genuine challenges. These particular cadets showed promise in some ways, but they were also displaying the kind of casual cruelty and thoughtless superiority that could be dangerous in future leaders. Samuel finished cleaning the trophy case and moved on to the next section of hallway. As he worked, his mind wandered back to his early days at the academy, when he had first taken the job as a janitor. The decision had surprised everyone who knew his true background, but Samuel had his reasons for choosing this particular form of retirement. The academy represented something important to him. It was where the next generation of military leaders was being shaped and trained. By working here, even in such a humble capacity, he felt he could still contribute something meaningful to the institution he had served his entire adult life. More importantly, it gave him a unique opportunity to observe these future officers from a perspective they would never suspect. Over the years, Samuel had watched hundreds of young cadets pass through these halls. He had seen the arrogant ones learn humility through failure and hardship. He had watched the shy ones find their courage and confidence. He had observed the natural leaders emerge from unexpected places, and he had seen promising prospects reveal fatal character flaws under pressure. But he had also seen the ones who never learned, who graduated with their prejudices and blind spots intact, who went on to positions of authority without ever developing the wisdom or empathy necessary for true leadership. Those were the ones who worried him most. The morning routine continued as more cadets began moving through the building. Some hurried past without acknowledgement, absorbed in their own concerns and conversations. Others offered polite nods or brief greetings, displaying the basic courtesy their training had instilled in them. A few, however, seemed to take particular pleasure in making Samuel's presence known in less flattering ways. "Excuse me, janitor," called out Cadet Robert Hayes, a third-year student who came from a long line of military officers and never let anyone forget it. "You missed a spot over there by the water fountain. Might want to get that before the commandant sees it." Samuel looked over to where Hayes was pointing and saw nothing but perfectly clean floor. He nodded quietly and made his way over to the fountain anyway, giving it another unnecessary cleaning while Hayes and his friends snickered among themselves. "That's what I like to see," Hayes continued, loud enough for his companions to hear. "A man who knows his place and takes pride in his work, even if it's just mopping floors." The comment stung not because it was insulting, but because it revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of what pride in work actually meant. Samuel had taken tremendous pride in his work his entire life, whether he was commanding troops in combat zones or ensuring that these hallways were spotless for the next generation of cadets. As the morning progressed, Samuel noticed patterns in how different groups of cadets interacted with him. The first-year students were generally more polite, still new enough to the academy that they hadn't yet developed the casual arrogance that sometimes came with seniority. The second and third-year students varied widely, with some showing genuine respect for all the academy staff, and others displaying the kind of casual dismissiveness that suggested they viewed manual labor as beneath their notice. But it was the fourth-year students, the ones closest to graduation and commissioning as officers, who concerned Samuel the most. These were the cadets who would soon be responsible for leading real soldiers in real situations. Their attitudes towards service, respect, and human dignity would directly impact the lives of the men and women under their command. Around mid-morning, Samuel was cleaning the windows in the main administration building when he overheard a conversation that particularly troubled him. A group of senior cadets had gathered in the hallway outside the commandant's office, waiting for appointments with the academic advisor. "I can't wait to get out of here and, finally, start my real career," said Cadet Alexandra Morgan, whose grandfather had been a decorated general and whose appointment to the academy had been practically guaranteed from birth. "All this theoretical stuff is fine, but I'm ready to actually command some troops." "Same here," agreed Cadet David Thompson, who had consistently ranked in the top 10% of his class academically, but had always struggled with the more practical aspects of leadership training. "I mean, how hard can it be, really? You tell people what to do, and they do it. That's what the chain of command is for." Samuel paused in his window cleaning, though he was careful not to appear to be eavesdropping. These kinds of conversations always made him deeply uncomfortable, because they revealed fundamental misunderstandings about what military leadership actually required. The thing is, continued Morgan, you have to make sure the enlisted personnel understand their place from day one. My grandfather always said that familiarity breeds contempt. Keep your distance, maintain your authority, and never let them think they're your equals. Thompson nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Like that old janitor who's always hanging around. Perfect example of someone who knows his place. Probably never had an original thought in his life, just follows orders and does his simple little job. That's the kind of respect we need to command from our subordinates. Samuel felt his jaw tighten slightly, though his expression remained neutral. The casual dismissiveness was bad enough, but the fundamental misunderstanding of leadership it represented was genuinely troubling. These young people were months away from being responsible for real soldiers with real lives and real families, and they seemed to view those future subordinates as little more than automated tools to be commanded and controlled. He finished the windows and moved on to his next task, but the conversation stayed with him. This wasn't the first time he had heard similar sentiments from graduating cadets, and it wouldn't be the last. But each time, it reminded him of why his current position, humble as it might appear, was actually quite important. The truth was that Samuel's presence at the academy served multiple purposes beyond simple employment. He was conducting an ongoing assessment of the institution's effectiveness in developing genuine leaders rather than mere commanders. His observations, compiled in detailed reports that he submitted annually to certain interested parties in the Pentagon, helped inform policy decisions about military education and officer development programs. But, more immediately, his daily interactions with these future officers provided him with insights into their character and potential that formal evaluations and academic performance could never reveal. How a person treated those they perceived as inferior or irrelevant often revealed more about their true nature than any number of leadership exercises or ethical training modules. As lunchtime approached, Samuel made his way to the cafeteria to begin the afternoon cleaning routine. The large dining hall was bustling with activity as cadets lined up for their meals and gathered around tables to eat and socialize. The noise level was considerable, with hundreds of young voices mixing together in the kind of energetic chaos that only institutional dining could produce. Samuel began cleaning tables that had been vacated by early lunch groups, working systematically through the dining area while staying out of the way of the ongoing meal service. His movements were efficient and unobtrusive, honed by years of practice in remaining invisible while still accomplishing necessary tasks. As he worked, he couldn't help but overhear fragments of conversation from nearby tables. The topics ranged from academic concerns to social drama to career aspirations, painting a picture of young people grappling with the challenges of growing up in a highly structured and demanding environment. At one table, a group of second-year cadets was discussing their upcoming field training exercise with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Their conversation revealed genuine enthusiasm for the military profession and a healthy respect for the challenges they would face as future officers. But at another table, Samuel heard a different kind of discussion that made him pause in his cleaning. A group of third-year cadets was engaged in what could only be described as a systematic demolition of everyone they considered beneath their social status at the academy. "Did you see that pathetic display in military history class yesterday?" laughed Cadet Brian Foster, whose mediocre grades were consistently overlooked because of his family's political connections. Professor Martinez actually asked for input from Cadet Johnson. "I mean, why would anyone care what some scholarship kid from Alabama thinks about military strategy?" The comment referred to Cadet Michael Johnson, a brilliant young man from a working-class family who had earned his place at the academy through academic excellence and demonstrated leadership potential. Samuel had observed Johnson over the past 3 years and had been consistently impressed by his integrity, work ethic, and natural ability to inspire respect from his peers. "I know, right?" agreed Cadet Sarah Phillips, whose father owned several defense contracting companies and who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with money or influence. "Like, there's a reason some people are meant to be leaders and others are meant to follow orders. Johnson should just focus on being grateful for the opportunity instead of trying to act like he belongs in the same conversations as people who were born for this." Samuel felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same controlled fury he had experienced countless times when witnessing injustice or cruelty in action. But he also felt something else, a deep concern for what these attitudes would mean when these cadets became commissioned officers responsible for the lives and welfare of enlisted personnel. The conversation continued, with the group systematically dismissing and belittling various classmates who didn't meet their arbitrary standards of social acceptability. They mocked accents, family backgrounds, physical appearances, and personal struggles with the casual cruelty that only truly privileged young people could muster. But then, the conversation took a turn that brought it uncomfortably close to Samuel's own situation. "Speaking of people who know their place," Foster said, gesturing towards Samuel with his fork, "at least the janitor doesn't try to pretend he's something he's not. Guy just keeps his head down and does his simple little job without bothering anyone important." Phillips giggled at the comment. "My roommate was saying the other day that she actually feels kind of sorry for him. Like, imagine being that old and having accomplished so little in life that you're still pushing a mop around for minimum wage. It's almost tragic." "I don't feel sorry for him at all," interjected Cadet Kevin Wright, whose own academic performance was mediocre at best but who never missed an opportunity to assert his superiority over others. "Somebody has to do the grunt work, right? Better him than someone with actual potential." Samuel continued his cleaning methodically, giving no outward sign that he had heard their conversation. But internally, he was making mental notes about each of the speakers, adding their comments to his growing assessment of their character and leadership potential. The afternoon passed slowly, with Samuel moving through his routine tasks while observing the complex social dynamics that played out around him. He cleaned classrooms where passionate discussions about military history and ethical leadership took place. He maintained facilities where future officers learned about honor, duty, and service to something greater than themselves. But he also witnessed moments of casual cruelty, thoughtless arrogance, and disturbing indifference to the dignity of others. These moments troubled him deeply, not because they affected him personally, but because they suggested serious flaws in how some of these future officers understood their responsibilities to the people they would eventually lead. As evening approached, and the academy began to quiet down for the night, Samuel completed his final tasks and prepared to secure his equipment. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine, another opportunity to observe and assess the character of these future military leaders. Walking across the campus toward the maintenance building where he stored his supplies, Samuel reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. There was a time when he had commanded respect through rank and authority, when his words carried the weight of institutional power and his decisions affected the lives of thousands of soldiers. Now he wielded a different kind of influence, one that operated through quiet observation and careful assessment rather than direct command. His reports on the Academy's effectiveness in developing true leaders had already influenced several policy changes in military education. His insights into the character and potential of individual cadets had helped identify both promising future leaders and potentially problematic ones. But, perhaps most importantly, his presence served as a constant reminder that true worth and dignity existed independent of rank, status, or social position. Whether the young cadets recognized it or not, they were being evaluated not just on their academic performance or military bearing, but on how they treated the people they encountered every day, especially those they perceived as having no power or importance. As Samuel locked up his supplies and prepared to leave for the day, he wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would it be another day of casual dismissiveness and thoughtless cruelty? Or might it finally be time for some of these young people to learn that the world was far more complex and surprising than their privileged backgrounds had led them to believe? Only time would tell. But Samuel knew that eventually, the truth had a way of revealing itself, often in the most unexpected circumstances and at the most surprising moments. And when that happened, the lessons learned would be ones that these cadets would remember for the rest of their lives. The campus grew quiet as Samuel made his way home, leaving behind a community of future officers who had no idea that their every interaction was being observed and evaluated by someone who understood military leadership better than any of them could imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Samuel had overheard the particularly troubling conversation in the cafeteria, and the behavior of certain cadets had only grown worse. The approaching graduation ceremony seemed to inflate their sense of superiority rather than humble them with the weight of upcoming responsibility. Samuel had documented several incidents in his weekly reports, but he knew that real change often required more dramatic interventions. The morning started like any other, with Samuel arriving at his usual time to find the academy grounds covered in a light frost that made everything sparkle in the early dawn light. He had always found these quiet morning hours peaceful, a time for reflection before the chaos of academic life began in earnest. But today felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't quite identify. As he made his way through the main academic building, Samuel noticed unusual activity in the administrative wing. Staff members were moving with more purpose than usual, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of excitement running through the early morning conversations he overheard. Something significant was happening, though he couldn't determine what it might be. His first indication of the day's unusual nature came when he encountered Mrs. Henderson, the academy's long-serving administrative secretary, rushing down the hallway with an armload of files and a slightly frantic expression. "Oh, Samuel," she called out when she saw him. "Thank goodness you're here early today. We're going to need all the common areas absolutely spotless. We have a very important visitor coming this afternoon, and the commandant is insisting that everything be perfect." Samuel nodded and adjusted his cleaning schedule accordingly. Important visitors weren't uncommon at the academy, though they usually came with more advance notice. Military dignitaries, political figures, and distinguished alumni frequently toured the facilities, often as part of fundraising efforts or public relations initiatives. "Anyone in particular I should know about?" Samuel asked, though he kept his tone casual and deferential, maintaining the persona he had carefully cultivated over his years at the academy. Mrs. Henderson paused and lowered her voice slightly. "Actually, it's quite extraordinary. General Patricia Williams is coming for an unannounced inspection. You know, the General Williams who just finished her tour as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. She's apparently interested in observing the academy's daily operations without all the usual ceremony and preparation." Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of anticipation and concern. General Williams had a reputation throughout the military as someone who valued substance over appearance, who could spot artificial displays of competence from a mile away, and who had little patience for the kind of performative leadership that often characterized military education institutions. If she was conducting an unannounced inspection, it meant she was looking for authentic insights into how the academy actually functioned when it wasn't putting on a show for visitors. That could be very good or very bad, depending on what she encountered during her visit. "The commandant is beside himself," Mrs. Henderson continued. "He's rescheduled 3 meetings and canceled this afternoon's parade practice so that all the cadets will be in their regular classes when she arrives. He wants her to see normal academy life, not some stage demonstration." Samuel absorbed this information while mentally adjusting his plans for the day. If General Williams was as observant as her reputation suggested, she would notice everything during her visit, including how the cadets interacted with staff members like himself. That could present interesting opportunities, depending on how events unfolded. The morning progressed with heightened activity throughout the academy. Word of the important visitor had spread quickly through the cadet population, creating an atmosphere of nervous energy and increased attention to military bearing. Samuel watched with interest as cadets who normally slouched through the hallways suddenly remembered to maintain perfect posture, and conversations that might usually include casual profanity became models of professional discourse. But he also noticed that some things didn't change. The cadets who had consistently shown respect and courtesy continued to do so, while those who had developed habits of casual cruelty and dismissiveness seemed to believe that their behavior towards staff members was beneath the notice of visiting dignitaries. This became particularly apparent during the mid-morning break, when Samuel was cleaning the main student lounge area. A group of senior cadets had gathered around one of the large tables, ostensibly studying for upcoming examinations, but actually engaged in their usual practice of social commentary and character assassination. "I heard the visitor is some big-shot general," said Cadet Foster. the same young man who had made disparaging comments about scholarship students weeks earlier. Probably just another political appointment looking for a photo opportunity before retirement. My father knows her, added Cadet Phillips, always eager to demonstrate her family's connections to important people. He says she's competent enough, but that she got where she is by playing politics rather than through real military achievement. You know how it is with some of these diversity promotions. Samuel felt his jaw tighten at the casual dismissiveness and underlying prejudice in the comment, but he continued his work without visible reaction. These were exactly the kinds of attitudes that concerned him most about the Academy's output of future officers. Cadet Wright, never one to miss an opportunity to display his own supposed sophistication, chimed in with his own analysis. The thing is, these inspection visits are all for show anyway. They come in, everyone pretends everything is perfect, they leave some positive comments, and nothing actually changes. It's just bureaucratic theater. Exactly, agreed Foster. Like, what is she really going to learn by walking around here for a few hours? She'll see some classes, maybe watch a drill demonstration, shake hands with the commandant, and declare everything wonderful. Meanwhile, the real work of turning us into officers happens regardless of what visitors think. The conversation continued in this vein, with the cadets displaying a cynical sophistication that Samuel found deeply troubling. These young people seemed to view the entire military structure as a kind of elaborate game in which appearances mattered more than substance, and in which authority figures were to be managed rather than respected. But what concerned him most was their casual assumption that they could control how they were perceived by others, that they could simply present different versions of themselves depending on who was watching. This kind of calculated duplicity was exactly the opposite of the authentic leadership that effective military service required. As lunchtime approached, the energy level throughout the academy continued to build. Samuel noticed maintenance staff members double-checking every detail of the building's appearance, faculty members reviewing lesson plans with unusual intensity, and cadets practicing military bearing with exaggerated precision. The announcement came over the Academy's public address system just as Samuel was finishing his cleaning of the main dining area. Attention, all personnel. Our distinguished visitor will be arriving at 1400 hours for a tour of academic and residential facilities. All cadets and staff should continue normal activities and routines. This is an observational visit, not a formal inspection. Despite the announcement's emphasis on normal activities, Samuel could see that everyone was operating with heightened awareness and careful attention to details that might usually be overlooked. But he also knew that experienced military leaders like General Williams were skilled at seeing through such performances to the underlying reality of institutional culture. The afternoon classes proceeded with unusual intensity, as faculty members delivered lessons with extra polish and cadets participated with enhanced enthusiasm. Samuel moved through his routine tasks, but he found himself paying particular attention to the interactions between cadets and staff members, knowing that these moments of casual interaction often revealed more about institutional character than formal presentations. At precisely 2 o'clock, Samuel was cleaning the trophy cases in the main hallway when he heard the distinctive sound of approaching footsteps that indicated the arrival of the inspection party. General Williams entered the building accompanied by the Academy Commandant, Colonel Harrison, and a small group of administrative staff members. Samuel glanced up briefly from his work, long enough to get a clear view of the visiting general. She was a woman of medium height with steel gray hair and the kind of bearing that commanded respect without requiring announcement. Her uniform was immaculate, but not showy, and her manner was professional and observant rather than ceremonial. What struck Samuel most was her eyes. They moved constantly, taking in every detail of her surroundings with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read institutional culture through careful observation. She wasn't just touring the facilities. She was conducting a comprehensive evaluation of everything she encountered. As you can see, General, Colonel Harrison was saying as the group approached Samuel's location, we maintain the highest standards of facility maintenance and appearance. Our support staff takes great pride in ensuring that the academy environment reflects our commitment to excellence. General Williams nodded politely, but didn't respond directly. Instead, Samuel noticed, Her attention seemed to focus on the actual condition of the facilities rather than the commandant's commentary about them. She was making her own assessments independent of the official narrative being presented to her. The inspection party moved past Samuel without acknowledgement, which was exactly what he had expected. In his current role, he was part of the background scenery, invisible to official attention unless something went wrong that required his intervention. But, as the group continued down the hallway, Samuel heard General Williams ask a question that surprised him. "Colonel, I'd like to observe some normal classroom interactions. Could we visit a few classes that are currently in session without advance notice to the instructors?" This was exactly the kind of request that would make academy administrators nervous. Unannounced classroom visits meant that faculty members and cadets would have to perform without preparation, revealing the actual quality of education being delivered rather than carefully rehearsed demonstrations. "Of course, General," Colonel Harrison replied, though Samuel could detect a slight tension in his voice. "We're proud of the education we provide here, and we're confident that you'll find our academic standards impressive." As the inspection party moved toward the academic wing, Samuel continued his work, but positioned himself so that he could observe their progress through the building. He was particularly interested in how the cadets would behave when confronted with unexpected high-level observation. The first classroom they visited was a military history seminar being taught by Professor Martinez, one of the Academy's most respected faculty members. Samuel could see through the doorway as General Williams and her entourage entered the room quietly and took seats in the back. The class was engaged in a discussion about leadership during crisis situations, using historical examples to illustrate principles that the cadets would need to understand as future officers. Professor Martinez handled the unexpected visitors with aplomb, continuing his lesson without missing a beat while the cadets maintained their focus on the academic material. Samuel was pleased to see that several of the cadets he had identified as having genuine leadership potential performed well under the unexpected scrutiny. Cadet Johnson, the scholarship student who had been the target of dismissive comments from his classmates, delivered a particularly thoughtful analysis of decision-making under pressure that impressed both the instructor and the visiting general. But the second classroom visit revealed a different side of academy life. The inspection party entered an ethics seminar just as the instructor was leading a discussion about the treatment of subordinates and the responsibilities of military leadership. This class included several of the cadets whose behavior Samuel had been documenting over the past months, including Foster, Phillips, and Wright. As the discussion proceeded, it became clear that these students had absorbed the theoretical concepts being taught but had not internalized them in any meaningful way. When asked about the importance of respecting all service members regardless of rank or background, Cadet Foster delivered a textbook-perfect response about dignity and professionalism. But Samuel, who had heard this same cadet making disparaging comments about enlisted personnel and support staff, knew that the words were hollow performance rather than genuine understanding. General Williams seemed to sense this disconnect as well. Samuel noticed her taking notes during the discussion, and her questions to the cadets were probing and specific, designed to test whether their understanding went beyond memorized responses to actual comprehension of leadership principles. The inspection continued through several more classrooms before the party returned to the main administrative area. Samuel positioned himself to overhear their debriefing conversation, which took place in Colonel Harrison's office with the door partially open. "Overall, Colonel, I'm impressed with the academic quality I observed today," General Williams was saying. "Your faculty members are clearly knowledgeable and committed, and many of your cadets demonstrate genuine understanding of military principles and leadership concepts." Samuel heard the relief in Colonel Harrison's voice as he responded. "Thank you, General. We work very hard to maintain the highest educational standards and to prepare these young people for the responsibilities they'll face as commissioned officers." But then, General Williams continued with observations that made Samuel pay closer attention. "However, I did notice some concerning patterns in how certain cadets interact with different groups of people. There seems to be a disconnect between their theoretical understanding of leadership principles and their practical application of those principles in daily life." Colonel Harrison's response was cautious. "Could you elaborate on that concern, General?" "Well," General Williams replied, I observed several instances where cadets who could articulate sophisticated concepts about respect and dignity in the classroom seemed to display very different attitudes toward people they perceived as being in subordinate positions. That kind of inconsistency suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of what military leadership actually requires. This was exactly the kind of observation Samuel had been hoping an experienced officer like General Williams would make. The Academy's formal curriculum was excellent, but its effectiveness was undermined by the persistence of attitudes and behaviors that contradicted its core principles. I'd like to spend some additional time observing informal interactions, General Williams continued. Perhaps we could tour some of the common areas where cadets gather between classes. I'm particularly interested in seeing how they behave when they think they're not being officially evaluated. Samuel felt a surge of anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, when the carefully maintained facades would be dropped and the true character of these future officers would be revealed. The inspection party made its way back to the main student areas, where cadets were gathered between afternoon classes. Samuel continued his cleaning routine, making himself as invisible as possible while positioning himself to observe the interactions that were about to unfold. At first, the cadets maintained their heightened attention to military bearing and professional conduct. But, as the inspection party moved through the area asking casual questions and engaging in informal conversation, the atmosphere gradually relaxed and more natural behaviors began to emerge. The critical moment came when General Williams, while speaking with a group of senior cadets about their post-graduation plans, noticed Samuel working quietly nearby. What happened next would determine whether months of careful observation and documentation would finally result in the kind of teachable moment these young people desperately needed. "Excuse me," General Williams said, stepping away from the group of cadets and approaching Samuel directly. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Samuel looked up from his cleaning with the appropriately deferential expression he had maintained throughout his years at the Academy. But something in General Williams' tone and manner suggested that this interaction was going to be different from the countless others he had experienced with visiting officials. "No, ma'am," Samuel replied quietly. "I'm just part of the maintenance staff. Nothing important." But, even as he spoke the words, Samuel could see something shifting in General Williams' expression, a look of recognition that made his pulse quicken. After years of maintaining his carefully constructed invisibility, the moment of revelation was finally at hand. The cadets who had been speaking with General Williams gathered closer, curious about why an important visitor would waste time talking to a janitor. Their expressions ranged from puzzlement to barely concealed impatience, and Samuel could almost hear them wondering why she was bothering with someone so obviously beneath her notice. What none of them realized was that this moment would become a defining experience in their military education, one that would force them to confront the gap between their theoretical understanding of leadership and their actual behavior toward the people around them. The stage was set for a lesson that would be remembered long after graduation, one that would challenge everything these young people thought they knew about respect, dignity, and the true nature of military service. General Williams studied Samuel's face with the intensity of someone trying to place a half-remembered detail. The maintenance uniform and cleaning cart created a cognitive dissonance that she was clearly working to resolve. Samuel maintained his humble posture, but there was something in his bearing that couldn't be completely hidden, even after years of practice. "Have we met before?" General Williams asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that made the surrounding cadets exchange puzzled glances. Samuel hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. After 8 years of carefully maintained anonymity, this was the moment when his two worlds might collide. He could deflect the question, maintain his cover, and continue observing these future officers from the shadows. Or he could allow the truth to emerge and see what lessons might be learned from the revelation. "I don't believe so, ma'am," Samuel replied carefully. "Though I've been working here for quite some time. Perhaps you've seen me around during previous visits." But General Williams wasn't satisfied with that explanation. Something about Samuel's voice, his posture, or perhaps the way he held himself even while pushing a cleaning cart was triggering memories that refused to be dismissed. The group of senior cadets, led by Foster and Phillips, was growing visibly impatient with the extended conversation. They had expected to be the focus of the general's attention during her visit, and watching her spend time talking to a janitor was both confusing and slightly insulting to their sense of importance. "General," Cadet Foster interjected with barely concealed condescension. "Perhaps we should continue the tour. I'm sure the maintenance staff can wait until later if you need to discuss cleaning schedules or something." The dismissive tone and casual assumption that Samuel's presence was an interruption rather than a conversation worth having revealed exactly the kind of attitude that General Williams had been observing throughout her visit. "Actually, Cadet," General Williams replied without taking her eyes off Samuel, "I think this conversation might be quite educational. For all of us." Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every instinct developed over decades of military service told him that this was a critical juncture, one where the choice he made would have consequences extending far beyond his personal situation. Around them, more cadets had begun to gather, drawn by curiosity about why an important visitor was engaged in extended conversation with a member of the maintenance staff. The crowd now included many of the young people whose behavior Samuel had been documenting, as well as others whose character he had assessed more favorably. Among the gathering crowd, Samuel noticed Cadet Johnson, the scholarship student who had consistently demonstrated integrity and leadership potential despite facing social obstacles from his more privileged classmates. Johnson's expression was attentive rather than dismissive, suggesting that he understood something significant was happening even if he couldn't identify exactly what it was. "Your posture," General Williams continued, still studying Samuel intently, "reminds me of someone I served with years ago in Operation Desert Shield. A young colonel who had a particular way of carrying himself, even in the most casual circumstances." Samuel felt his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. The specific reference to Desert Shield, combined with the rank identification, suggested that General Williams' memories were becoming more focused and accurate. Cadet Phillips, perhaps sensing that the conversation was moving in a direction that didn't center on her own importance, decided to intervene with what she clearly believed was helpful clarification. "General, I think there might be some confusion here. This is just our janitor. He's been cleaning these buildings for years. I'm sure he's never served in any significant military capacity, or he wouldn't be pushing a mop around at his age." The comment was delivered with the casual cruelty that Samuel had come to expect from Phillips, but hearing it spoken directly in front of General Williams added a new dimension of discomfort to the situation. The young woman was revealing not just her own prejudices, but her fundamental misunderstanding of how military careers actually worked. General Williams turned to look at Phillips with an expression that made several nearby cadets instinctively straighten their posture. "Cadet Phillips, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Tell me, what do you know about the various paths that military careers can take?" Phillips, suddenly, aware that she might have misspoken, tried to recover her footing. "Well, ma'am, I understand that there are different career tracks and specializations. But, obviously, someone with significant military experience would be in a position of authority rather than working in maintenance." "Obviously," General Williams repeated, her tone suggesting that nothing about the situation was obvious at all. "And what makes you so certain about that assessment?" Samuel watched this exchange with growing concern. While he appreciated that General Williams was challenging Phillips' assumptions, he also worried about the broader implications of what was unfolding. His presence at the academy served specific purposes that could be compromised if his background became widely known. But before he could find a way to redirect the conversation, General Williams took a step that changed everything. "Colonel Martinez," she said, using the name and rank that Samuel hadn't heard spoken aloud in nearly a decade. "Samuel Martinez, 3rd Armored Division, Operation Desert Shield, 1991. You were the logistics coordinator who kept our supply lines intact when everyone said it couldn't be done." The impact of those words was immediate and electric. Every cadet in the immediate area fell silent, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they processed what they had just heard. The janitor they had dismissed, mocked, and ignored for years was apparently a former colonel with significant military achievements. Samuel felt the weight of years of careful concealment falling away. There was no point in denial now, not when General Williams could undoubtedly provide specific details about his service record if necessary. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, his posture unconsciously shifting to reflect the military bearing he had spent years suppressing. Though I'd prefer to keep that in the past, if possible. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Even without changing his uniform or abandoning his cleaning cart, Samuel somehow occupied the space differently, his presence commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with rank or title. Cadet Foster, whose earlier comments about Samuel knowing his place now seemed particularly ill-chosen, was staring with an expression of disbelief mixed with dawning horror at the implications of his previous behavior. "But," stammered Cadet Wright, "why would you? I mean, if you're a former colonel, why are you working as?" He couldn't finish the sentence, perhaps finally, realizing how insulting it would sound to question someone's career choices, especially when those choices involved honest work regardless of the person's background. General Williams answered the unfinished question. "Cadet Wright, one of the most important lessons you can learn as a future officer is that a person's current position tells you nothing about their worth, their experience, or their potential contribution to any situation. Colonel Martinez's choice to serve this institution in his current capacity demonstrates exactly the kind of selfless dedication that we hope to instill in all our graduates." Samuel appreciated the support, but he could see the complex emotions playing across the faces of the gathered cadets. Some appeared genuinely ashamed of their previous behavior, while others seemed more concerned about potential consequences for their earlier comments and actions. "The question," General Williams continued, "is what you've learned from having Colonel Martinez among you for these past years. Have you treated him with the respect that every person deserves, regardless of their position? Have you recognized the dignity inherent in all honest work? Have you understood that leadership means serving others, not considering yourself above them?" The silence that followed this question was profound and uncomfortable. Samuel could see several cadets reliving conversations and interactions from their time at the academy, suddenly, viewing their behavior from an entirely different perspective. Cadet Johnson stepped forward from the crowd, his expression serious and thoughtful. "Colonel Martinez," he said, "I want to apologize on behalf of all of us. Not just because of your rank or service record, but because we should have treated you with respect regardless of those things. The fact that we didn't reveals a serious failure in our understanding of what military service actually means." Samuel was impressed by Johnson's response, which demonstrated exactly the kind of character and integrity that made him stand out among his peers. But he was also concerned about how the other cadets would react to this implicit criticism of their behavior. Cadet Foster, perhaps realizing that damage control was necessary, attempted his own form of apology. "Colonel, I hope you understand that any comments we might have made were not intended disrespectfully. We simply didn't realize your background. And if we had known—" "Cadet Foster," Samuel interrupted gently, "the problem isn't that you didn't know my background. The problem is that you believe someone's background should determine how you treat them. Every person deserves basic respect and dignity, regardless of their rank, their job, or their history." The truth of this statement hung in the air like a challenge. These young people were being forced to confront the gap between their theoretical understanding of military values and their actual behavior toward people they considered unimportant. Phillips, who had been unusually quiet since General Williams' revelation, finally found her voice. "But surely you understand that military hierarchy requires different levels of interaction with different categories of personnel. I mean, we can't treat everyone exactly the same way, can we?" General Williams fielded this question with the patient tone of an experienced educator addressing a fundamental misunderstanding. "Cadet Phillips, respecting someone's dignity and treating them with basic courtesy is not the same thing as ignoring appropriate military protocol. You can maintain professional boundaries while still recognizing every person's inherent worth." Samuel watched the cadets processing this concept, some with genuine understanding and others with the kind of intellectual resistance that suggested deep-seated attitudes wouldn't change easily. The crowd around them had continued to grow, and Samuel noticed that faculty members and staff were beginning to take notice of the gathering. Soon, word would spread throughout the academy that the quiet janitor was actually a former colonel, and his carefully maintained anonymity would be permanently destroyed. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. His years of observation had provided valuable insights into the academy's culture and the character of its students. Maybe it was time for those insights to be shared more directly, even if it meant abandoning the unique perspective that his disguised position had provided. Colonel Martinez, General Williams said, I think there's a conversation we need to have privately. Would you be available to meet with me this evening? Of course, ma'am, Samuel replied. Though I should mention that my current position here serves specific purposes that might be compromised by today's revelations. General Williams nodded understandingly. I suspected as much. We'll discuss the implications and determine the best path forward. As the crowd of cadets began to disperse, many of them casting backward glances filled with curiosity, shame, or confusion, Samuel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. After years of careful observation, his cover was blown, but the opportunity for genuine education and change might finally be at hand. The afternoon classes proceeded, but the normal routine of academy life had been disrupted by the revelation. Samuel continued his work, but the dynamics of every interaction had fundamentally changed. Cadets who had previously ignored him now watched nervously as he passed. Faculty members who had barely acknowledged his presence now nodded respectfully when they encountered him in the hallways. But the most significant change was in how the cadets interacted with each other. Word had spread quickly through the academy's informal communication networks, and, by evening, virtually everyone knew that the janitor was actually a decorated former colonel. Samuel overheard dozens of conversations as he completed his afternoon tasks, many of them focused on re-examining previous interactions and comments in light of the new information. Some cadets expressed genuine remorse for their behavior, while others seemed more concerned about potential consequences than actual understanding. The most telling conversations were among the senior cadets who had been most dismissive of Samuel in the past. Rather than reflecting on the broader implications of their behavior, many seemed focused on damage control and self-justification. How were we supposed to know? Phillips was saying to a group of her friends. If he wanted to be treated differently, he should have told people who he really was. You can't blame us for responding to the information we had. Foster nodded in agreement. Exactly. And, honestly, it's kind of deceptive for him to be working here under false pretenses. What if he's been spying on us or reporting our conversations to the administration? These responses revealed exactly the kind of character issues that Samuel had been documenting in his reports. Rather than accepting responsibility for their behavior or examining their underlying attitudes, these cadets were looking for ways to shift blame and avoid accountability. But other conversations gave Samuel more hope for the future of military leadership. Cadet Johnson was leading a discussion with several of his peers about the broader implications of what had happened. The point isn't that we should have known he was a colonel, Johnson was saying. The point is that we should treat everyone with basic respect, regardless of their position or background. The fact that we didn't do that reveals something important about our character that we need to address. As evening approached, and the academy settled into its nighttime routine, Samuel prepared for his meeting with General Williams. He had spent years compiling observations and assessments of the academy's effectiveness in developing military leaders, and now he would finally have the opportunity to share those insights with someone who had the authority to act on them. The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock in the Commandant's conference room, a choice of venue that suggested General Williams intended this to be an official discussion rather than a casual conversation. Samuel arrived precisely on time, having changed from his maintenance uniform into civilian clothes that reflected his true status and background. The transformation was remarkable. Without the cleaning cart and work clothes, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a senior military officer. General Williams was already waiting, along with Colonel Harrison, who appeared somewhat nervous about the direction this unexpected development might take. Colonel Martinez, General Williams began, I think it's time we discussed what you've really been doing here for the past 8 years. The conference room felt different at night, with its polished table reflecting the overhead lights and the Academy's history displayed in framed photographs along the walls. Samuel took his seat across from General Williams, while Colonel Harrison positioned himself at the head of the table, clearly uncertain about his role in whatever conversation was about to unfold. Before we begin, Samuel said, removing a thick folder from his briefcase, I think you should understand the scope of what I've been observing here. General Williams nodded for him to continue, her expression serious and attentive. 8 years ago, I was approached by a joint committee from the Pentagon and the Department of Defense Education Activity. They were concerned about reports that military academies were producing technically competent officers who lacked the character and leadership qualities necessary for effective service in modern conflicts. Colonel Harrison's expression tightened slightly. This was clearly the first time he was hearing about any formal assessment of his academy. The committee wanted an embedded assessment, Samuel continued. Someone who could observe daily interactions and institutional culture without the artificial behavior that occurs during official inspections and evaluations. My retirement timing made me an ideal candidate for deep cover assessment. Samuel opened the folder, revealing hundreds of pages of detailed observations, incident reports, and character assessments compiled over his years of service at the academy. What I found, he said, was an institution that excels at academic instruction and technical training but struggles with instilling genuine respect for others and authentic leadership character. Too many cadets graduate with sophisticated theoretical knowledge but fundamental gaps in human decency and ethical behavior. General Williams leaned forward, studying the documentation Samuel had spread across the table. Can you be more specific about these character deficiencies? The patterns are consistent across multiple graduating classes, Samuel replied. Cadets who can articulate beautiful theories about servant leadership and military values while simultaneously treating support staff, junior students, and anyone they perceive as socially inferior with casual cruelty and dismissiveness. He pulled out specific examples from his files, including detailed accounts of conversations he had overheard and behaviors he had witnessed over the years. Today's interactions were not aberrations, Samuel continued. They were representative of attitudes that persist throughout the cadet population, particularly among students from privileged backgrounds who view military service as a continuation of social status rather than a calling to serve others. Colonel Harrison, who had been listening with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. Colonel Martinez, while I appreciate your unique perspective, I think you may be overstating the severity of these issues. Young people sometimes speak carelessly, but our graduates consistently receive positive evaluations from their commanding officers. Samuel turned to face the commandant directly. Colonel Harrison, with respect, positive evaluations of technical competence don't measure character deficiencies. An officer can be tactically proficient while still lacking the moral foundation necessary for ethical leadership under pressure. General Williams intervened before the discussion could become confrontational. Colonel Martinez, what specific recommendations do you have based on your observations? Samuel had been preparing for this question for years. He pulled out another section of his documentation. This one focused on potential solutions rather than problems. The core issue is that the academy treats character development as a separate component of education rather than integrating it into every aspect of institutional life, he began. Cadets learn about ethics in formal classes, but apply different standards in their daily interactions. He outlined a comprehensive program that would fundamentally change how the academy approached leadership development, including mandatory service rotations where cadets would work in support roles, regular assessments of how students treated all community members regardless of rank, and consequences for behavior that contradicted stated values. The goal isn't to eliminate hierarchy or military protocol, Samuel explained. The goal is to ensure that every graduate understands that leadership means serving others, not dominating them, and that every person deserves basic respect regardless of their position or background. As the conversation continued late into the evening, Samuel shared story after story from his years of observation. He described cadets who had transformed from arrogant teenagers into genuine leaders through experiences that humbled them and forced them to recognize their own limitations. But he also documented others who had graduated with their prejudices and sense of superiority intact, going on to positions where their character deficiencies could affect the lives of real soldiers. General Williams took extensive notes, asking probing questions about specific incidents and requesting detailed analysis of the institutional factors that contributed to problematic behavior patterns. The most concerning aspect, Samuel concluded, is that many of these cadets genuinely believe they understand military values because they can recite them accurately. They don't realize that intellectual knowledge without emotional and moral development is not just useless, but potentially dangerous. The meeting continued until well past midnight, with Samuel providing comprehensive briefings on individual cadets, institutional practices, and systemic issues that affected the Academy's effectiveness in developing authentic leaders. When they finally concluded, General Williams sat back in her chair with the expression of someone who had received more information than she had expected, but exactly what she needed to make important decisions. "Colonel Martinez," she said, "this assessment represents exactly the kind of insight we've been seeking. Your recommendations will form the basis for significant policy changes in military education." Over the following days, word of Samuel's true identity spread throughout the Academy community, creating ripple effects that reached far beyond the initial revelation. Some cadets sought him out to apologize for their previous behavior, while others seemed to avoid him entirely, apparently uncomfortable with the implications of what their actions had revealed about their character. The most significant changes, however, came from the administration. General Williams' report, based largely on Samuel's 8 years of documentation, triggered a comprehensive review of the Academy's practices and priorities. Within months, new policies were implemented that integrated character assessment into every aspect of Academy life. Cadets were required to complete service rotations in various support roles, giving them direct experience with the work they had previously dismissed as beneath their notice. Regular evaluations now included assessments of how students interacted with all community members, not just their peers and superiors. More importantly, the Academy began treating character development as the primary mission, with technical training and academic instruction serving to support that goal rather than replacing it. Samuel's role evolved as well. Rather than continuing his covert observation, he was offered a position as Director of Character Development, responsible for implementing and overseeing the cultural changes his assessment had recommended. The transition wasn't easy. Some cadets embraced the new emphasis on authentic leadership and moral development, recognizing it as essential preparation for the responsibilities they would face as officers. Others resisted, viewing the changes as unnecessary complications to their military education. Cadet Johnson became one of Samuel's most effective allies in implementing the cultural transformation. His natural leadership abilities and genuine commitment to serving others made him an ideal advocate for the new approach among his peers. "The thing is," Johnson explained to a group of skeptical classmates, "Colonel Martinez wasn't trying to catch us doing something wrong. He was trying to understand whether we were learning what we needed to know to be effective leaders. And clearly, some of us weren't." Phillips and Foster, among others, struggled more with the changes. Their resistance to acknowledging their previous behavior or accepting responsibility for character development revealed exactly the kind of attitudes the new policies were designed to address. "It's not fair to judge us based on casual comments we made years ago," Phillips complained during one particularly difficult character development session. "We're here to learn military tactics and strategy, not to be psychoanalyzed about every interaction we have with staff members." Samuel addressed these concerns with the patience of someone who understood that real change required time and persistent effort. "Cadet Phillips," he said during one group discussion, "the military tactics and strategy you're learning here will be useless if you don't have the character foundation to apply them ethically and effectively. Technical competence without moral development doesn't produce leaders. It produces dangerous people with authority." The broader impact of Samuel's assessment extended far beyond the Academy itself. His documentation of character deficiencies in military education contributed to policy changes at multiple institutions, creating a new emphasis on authentic leadership development throughout the military education system. Years later, Samuel would receive letters from graduates who had initially resented the character development requirements, but had come to understand their importance through real-world military experience. "Dear Colonel Martinez," wrote one former cadet who had become a company commander, "I wanted to thank you for the lessons you taught us, even when we were too stubborn to listen. Last month, my unit faced a crisis situation where technical training wasn't enough. The leadership principles you helped us develop made the difference between mission success and failure, and, more importantly, between bringing everyone home safely or not." Another graduate, now serving as a logistics coordinator in a challenging overseas assignment, wrote, "The emphasis on treating everyone with respect regardless of their position saved my career and possibly my life. When I arrived at my posting, I was working with local contractors and support staff who had been alienated by previous American officers. Because I understood the importance of genuine respect for all service members, I was able to rebuild those relationships and accomplish our mission." Samuel's favorite letter came from Cadet Johnson, now Major Johnson, who had been promoted ahead of schedule due to his exceptional leadership performance. "Colonel Martinez," Johnson wrote, "I've been thinking about your invisible years at the academy, and I finally understand what you accomplished. You didn't just assess our character. You gave us the opportunity to reveal it to ourselves. The cadets who were willing to examine their behavior and change grew into effective leaders. Those who resisted feedback and avoided responsibility continue to struggle with the human aspects of military service. You provided us with a mirror that reflected our true selves, not our idealized self-images." The academy itself underwent a fundamental transformation in the years following Samuel's assessment. The new emphasis on character development attracted different types of applicants and changed the institutional culture in ways that extended far beyond policy changes. Prospective cadets now understood that technical competence was just the baseline requirement for military service. The real preparation involved developing the moral courage, emotional intelligence, and genuine respect for others that effective leadership demanded. Samuel continued serving as Director of Character Development for 5 more years before retiring again, this time to a quiet life that reflected his decades of service to military education and leadership development. On his final day at the academy, he was honored at a ceremony that included many of the cadets whose character development he had influenced over the years. The gathering represented a new generation of military leaders who understood that strength came from serving others rather than dominating them. "Colonel Martinez taught us that leadership isn't about commanding respect through rank or authority," said the student speaker, a young woman whose own transformation from privilege to service exemplified the academy's new culture. "Real leadership means earning respect through character and extending that respect to every person you encounter regardless of their position or background." As Samuel looked out at the assembly of future officers, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from combat command to undercover assessment to open mentorship. Each phase had required different skills and perspectives, but all had been united by the same fundamental purpose: preparing military leaders who could serve their country with both competence and character. The academy that had once produced technically skilled officers with troubling character deficiencies now graduated leaders who understood that their greatest responsibility was to serve others, protect the vulnerable, and maintain the highest ethical standards even under pressure. Samuel's legacy lived on not in monuments or formal recognition, but in the countless daily interactions between military leaders and the people they served. His years of invisible observation had revealed the truth that character could only be developed through practice, and that the measure of a leader was found not in how they treated their superiors, but in how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. The old janitor had become a teacher, the teacher had become a mentor, and the mentor had helped transform an entire institution's understanding of what military leadership actually required. It was, Samuel thought as he drove away from the academy for the final time, exactly the kind of service he had always hoped to provide.